Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about a classic horror story. A classic horror story is an Italian horror movie that features a mixture of Italian and English language scenes, and tells the story of a group of strangers that travel together throughout the Italian countryside when an accident occurs that causes their vehicle to crash and they end up stranded in parts unknown. Although you think that their accident would lead them easy to spot by incoming motorists due to just being stranded on the side of the road or something like that, it turns out to be not the case in this particular situation, as when everyone wakes up from the accident, they find themselves stranded in a field seemingly in the middle of nowhere, so everyone leaves the RV that they're in to go and investigate the area, which leads them to make horrifying discoveries as they do. They quickly find out that they are not alone in the area that they're stuck in. All the local inhabitants of the area are extremely violent and hostile towards visitors, so it's up to the characters to team up together and try to find a way out of the area and bring themselves back into society while they are inevitably killed off one by one. Most of the characters featured here are pretty standard when it comes to your average typical violent horror movie. It's not necessarily that they're bad, but there's not a whole lot to write home about them either. However, there is one exception in the form of the main character. Matilda Lutz plays the lead role of Elisa in this movie, who you may recognize as playing the lead role in the French action thriller movie Revenge, which also had a similar amount of violence in that movie in comparison to this one. But insofar as her performance in this movie is concerned, she nails it. Out of all the characters that become increasingly more frightened as the horror escalates around them, she is the one that loses her mind the most. She undergoes an extreme amount of mental duress throughout the movie, as she's always caked in blood, screaming her vocal cords to the point of them breaking, crying constantly, and rivers of snot flowing out of her nose. I'm not trying to be disgusting when I use these descriptions, by the way, but when you have this much snot coming out of your nose in a scene of real, genuine horror, that is a sign of true acting talent right there. Aside from becoming more and more sympathetic as the movie's events proceed in that respect, she also has the most interesting backstory out of all the characters, and all the other characters have backstories too, but she's the one that has the most interesting one out of all of them, mostly by virtue of being the main character, and it was interesting to see how she drew parallels from her own backstory to that of another character who ends up joining the group later on. And like I said, there are other characters that help move the story along in this movie too. They're nowhere near as memorable as Elisa, but that's a pretty tough act to follow. You got your typical fat guy incel in the form of Fabrizio, your typical hot blonde in the form of Sophia, your typical hot jock slash boyfriend in the form of Mark, who happens to be the sole English presence in this movie, and then you got your typical quiet reserved guy in the form of Ricardo. The group also encounters a few other characters here and there while they're trying to escape the woods around them, and they sort of serve as wild cards to mix things up with the story and keep audiences guessing as to what's really happening on screen. So the characters aren't really fantastic, but they're not terrible either. They all have their place in the story where it fits. The movie is very much self-aware about what kind of movie it really is. It knows that it's a horror movie through and through, and it plays up every single cliche that it can, both for comedic and dramatic purposes. Heck, it even opens up with Fabrizio filming on a video camera in the same way that you might see in any other found footage horror movie or Blair Witch Project, something like that. All of the isolated sceneries of the Italian wilderness, all the horrifying relics that the characters encounter in the one house that happens to be in the area, and the Blair Witch-esque monuments that they find in the woods as they're trying to escape, they're all things that we've seen before in other horror movies in the past, and they all feel familiar in the back of our minds, but they still feel fresh enough in their presentation that they don't come off as complete copying. I'd like to think that just about every scene in this movie is paying tribute to some scene in another horror movie that's out there somewhere in the world. Heck, the movie even straight up name drops horror movies and directors of horror movies in certain cases. It usually happens when Fabrizio is having an enlightened discussion about them in an attempt to lighten the mood as the events unfold around them, and they provide a nice break to the tension of the story as it all unfolds. At the end of the day, though, a classic horror story is, well, a horror story, and it definitely does not shy away from the violence in this regard. The kills in this movie, while few in number, are some of the most brutal that you will see in a Netflix original, period. And it's not even the on-screen violence that's all that disturbing, although there are definitely a lot of gory bits that happen on camera, but some of the more gorier moments that they could have shown, the filmmakers instead decided to portray off-screen and leave what was happening to viewers' imaginations. And combined with the horrifying sound effects of characters screaming in agony and body parts crunching and squishing together, even though I wasn't seeing what was happening on screen, I was still covering my eyes. That's how terrifying they were. The movie also has an interesting mythology aspect to its story. I'm not going to get too much into it in this review for fear of avoiding spoilers, but the movie has an interesting lore behind it that sets up the events around the characters quite well. The movie features clues spread throughout its story for viewers to pick away from and try to interpret just what's really going on around the characters, which is great. I like that mystery aspect is there to help keep audiences guessing, but the clues I found didn't really have any payoff towards the end. I mean, technically there is sort of a payoff and an explanation given as to why the characters experience the events that they do in this movie, but it's not done well, and the actual scene where that explanation takes place is just straight up weird. It reminded me of Midsummer, and anyone who's seen that movie will know exactly what scene that I'm talking about in this one. This brings me back to my point about how this movie is self-aware with regards to all the horror movies that it references, and even though it is aware about these references and is occasionally using them tongue-in-cheek, it doesn't change the fact that it is very cliche in its presentation of them. I did mention that this movie does try to be as original as possible with how it presents certain things, but there were still things that annoy me regardless. The car won't start, there's dead animal heads on spikes, there's a guy that walks far away from the group to go in the middle of the woods and have a pee and proceeds to get spooked. All these little things add up more and more and more as the movie goes on. It doesn't really bother an average viewer like myself, but for a horror movie buff like someone else might be, I can see them being very annoyed as the movie progresses. This all being said though, as cliche as the movie can be at times, I have to say that the ending more than made up for it. I'm not going to spoil anything about it because again, I want to avoid spoilers in this review, but just so you know, it is cathartic in every sense of the word. Overall, a classic horror story has suspenseful thrills and violent kills that up the entertainment factor. It's a great horror story overall, though I wouldn't necessarily call it classic. If you're a fan of gory horror movies and you don't mind them being on the more cliche side of things, this movie is definitely for you. While I think it could have stood to be a bit more original with its story material, its awesome main character, excellent atmosphere, and a satisfying conclusion to boot make this a very fun horror story indeed. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of a classic horror story. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Philippine romance, My Amanda. Bye bye!